On to the other war now, which seems to have turned into a lost cause for the West. I'm talking about the Russia-Ukraine war. That Europe is getting war-weary is common knowledge at this point, but now Europe is coming to grips with the reality. It may not be in the position to help Ukraine anymore. But we are not the ones saying this. The bad news has been shared by EU's top diplomat, its foreign policy chief, Josep Borrell. On Tuesday, Josep Borrell said that the militaries of the EU member states have already supplied Ukraine with all the ammunition they could find in the existing stockpiles. He said that the European Union now has to rely on what can be domestically produced, meaning the Ukraine war has depleted Europe's arsenal. While until a few months ago, Ukraine's allies in Europe were scraping at the bottom of the barrel to arm Ukraine in its fight against Russia, now Europe just does not have any more weapons to give out. The top diplomat made the remarks ahead of the Foreign Affairs Council meeting when pressed on the EU's pledge to supply 1 million artillery shells to Kiev by March 2024. He said, and I'm quoting, "I do not have ammunition here in Brussels. I do not have a stock of ammunition. I have to mobilize the stocks of the European armies." The first track, providing what the armies already had in their stockpiles, is already finished. Now, from the stockpiles of the armies, it is difficult to get more. There you have it. According to Borrell, EU had provided Ukraine with over 300,000 artillery shells already. Earlier, it was reported that the EU has only provided 30% of the artillery shells it promised Ukraine. The top EU diplomat saying that the flow of ammunition to Ukraine now depends on the manufacturing capacities of European weapons makers. Forget about more weapons. Europe is struggling to produce and send Ukraine the weapons it has already promised the war-battered country. Then yesterday, a big admission. On Tuesday, the members of the European Union admitted that they may be on the way to failing Ukraine on their promise. This happened after a meeting of EU's defense and foreign affairs ministers in Brussels. The EU foreign policy chief, Josep Borrell, also cast doubt on the goal. Estonia's defense minister, Hanno Pevkur, stressed on the urgent need to ramp up the supply of weapons. He acknowledged how Russia has boosted the arms production. But on the battlefield, ammunition is the only thing that counts, and artillery rounds play a bigger role. Ukrainian forces use around 6,000 to 7,000 shells daily on the battlefield. But what has happened to the military equipment and the weapons that the West has provided Ukraine so far is the question. You see, the reality on the ground is much of what NATO provided Ukraine has been blown to smithereens by the Russian troops. Ukraine's much-hyped summer counter-offensive flopped, and Russian troops have recently also made confirmed gains in Donetsk region. The situation on the front lines is emblematic of the recent admission by Ukraine's commander-in-chief. The war has reached a stalemate, and now with weapons running out in the West and a war in West Asia taking all the attention away from Ukraine, Kiev seems to have become a lost cause for the West. San Francisco is hosting the APEC summit. Leaders from around the world are arriving, and all eyes are on one high-stake meeting, the one which is happening after a year, the meeting between US President Joe Biden and the Chinese President Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping has arrived in San Francisco. This is his first visit to the United States in 6 years. Overseas Chinese in the city gathered to welcome Xi Jinping. They lined up along the way from the airport to the hotel where Xi Jinping would be staying and waved Chinese flags. Xi Jinping is due to meet US President Joe Biden. Where exactly? The location has not been officially disclosed, but what we do know is it will be in the San Francisco Bay Area and it will be away from the main summit venue. Reports, however, saying that it will be at the historic and secluded country house of Filoli. When President Joe Biden was asked about his agenda for that meeting, this is what he had to say. Listen in.
To get back on a normal course of corresponding, being able to pick up the phone and talk to one another if there's a crisis, being able to make sure our military still have contact with one another. We can't take, as I told you, we're not trying to decouple from China. But what we're trying to do is change the relationship for the better.
You see, after a long spell of strained ties, the US is trying to make amends with China. And high on Joe Biden's priority list is restoring military-to-military communication with China. As for Xi Jinping, he is seeking to entice foreign investment. He is also expected to dine with top US business executives. You see, China is facing an economic slowdown, and America's restrictions on investments in China have not helped the cause. There are disagreements between the two superpowers in terms of security, in terms of human rights. Last year, the value of US foreign direct investment in China dropped to roughly $8 billion. This was the lowest level in nearly 2 decades. China had responded to the curbs with its own rules. It introduced limits on exports of critical minerals used to make computer chips. Simply put, a lot needs to be straightened out. While one meeting may not be able to solve everything, it is one step towards normalizing ties and opening communication. And Washington also hopes for more cooperation from Beijing in dealing with drug trafficking. The synthetic opioid drug fentanyl has become a menace in America, especially San Francisco. And the US seeks China's help to rein in its production. Other than that, there are wars to discuss, of course. While US-China ties seem to be toying with multiple high-level meetings and the leaders finally talking in person, there are several sticking points between the two. Earlier, the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken addressed ministers of the APEC. He stressed that the US believes in a region where economies are free to choose their own path and where goods, ideas, people flow lawfully and freely. Although Blinken stopped short of naming China, his words echoed the US rhetoric in recent years that China bullies smaller countries in the Indo-Pacific. The White House National Security Council spokesperson John Kirby, meanwhile, said, and I'm quoting, "President Biden is not going to be afraid to confront where confrontation is needed on certain issues where we don't see eye to eye." So what turn will this meeting take? Will the ties mend or will they fray further? Will the bromance brew between Xi Jinping and Joe Biden? For more on this, we are now being joined by Voice of America correspondent Jessica Stone, who is in San Francisco, getting us the very latest and monitoring all those developments. Jessica, hi. What are you picking up regarding the expectations from the Xi-Biden meeting?
President Biden coming into this meeting with Xi Jinping on the outskirts of San Francisco with a few goals, but above all, he really just wants to set a floor under the relationship, make sure it doesn't worsen, increase communication, and yet Washington has set expectations low for major outcomes coming out of this summit. That said, they are looking to achieve some domestic outcomes. Number one, this U.S. president, he's running for re-election, and there is a fentanyl crisis across the country. We have thousands of Americans dying of the drug overdose from fentanyl, a highly addictive substance that has precursors that come from China across the southern border. So he's going to look to reestablish previous agreements that China has made, hold them to account for those, and make sure that they are working hand in hand with U.S. drug enforcement and law enforcement officials on that issue. Number two, the U.S. really wants to increase military-to-military communication, reestablish it in effect, because they say during this Chinese spy balloon incident earlier this year in February, they could not get a hold of Beijing to find out what was going on. And with the increase and uptick in activity in the South China Sea, around the Taiwan Straits and other key parts that also include shipping lanes, which are important to the entire globe. The U.S. really wanting to have an opportunity to reestablish those military-to-military communications with Beijing in order to deconflict and prevent any escalation of a military nature.
Right. Jessica, to what extent will the two wars, the Russia-Ukraine war and the Israel-Hamas war, figure in the discussions given China's expanding outreach in West Asia?
You know, we saw this in New Delhi during the G20, even though that was an economic conference much like this one. The Ukraine war was front and center for many, in particular in the West. So this will be no different. President Biden is expected to bring up a range of issues, the entire slate of issues, because this is the first time he's met face-to-face with President Xi in almost a year. So during their 4-hour meeting, we do expect the Russia-Ukraine war to come up. We also expect the President of the United States to try to get China to put some pressure on Russia vis-a-vis North Korea and their cooperation around the deployment of the missile program and the nuclear weapons program in North Korea. In terms of West Asia, there could be a key role for China to play. Obviously, China has increased its involvement in the region economically and also more recently diplomatically. The U.S. is looking to Beijing to put some pressure on Tehran with respect to its funding of Hamas and Hezbollah. If Hezbollah were to open up another front in that war, it certainly escalates what has already become a very bloody and controversial war between Israel and Hamas in the Gaza Strip that's taking thousands of civilian lives every day. So the U.S. looking to Beijing to put some pressure on Tehran vis-a-vis Hezbollah and also vis-a-vis Hamas itself, which of course is backed by the Iranian government from a funding perspective. So these two hotspots could have real U.S.-China cooperation coming into play, and we expect President Biden to raise those as well.
Right, Jessica, we're leaving it there for the moment. Thanks very much for joining us with those inputs. Tonight on the show, we talk about the good, the bad, and the bizarre that's happening in the professional world. You might be working hard to climb up the ladder and get that appraisal, but what if I tell you an American woman quit her hotshot corporate job and now she makes a fortune just by talking to animals? I'm not narrating the plot of Dr. Dolittle or a similar movie. This is what has happened in real life. Meet Nikki Vasconez. Until 3 years ago, she was working as a lawyer. Her work days were long and stressful. She was unhappy with what she was doing, but she was just too afraid to make a change. And that is when she stumbled upon her hidden talent, and her life completely changed. Nikki discovered that she could communicate with animals, apparently. In the year 2021, she began her own business. She made social media accounts talking about her capabilities, and soon Nikki started getting popular. People started following her social media handles. As of now, she has some 312,000 followers on TikTok and 87,000 on Instagram. And it wasn't long before requests started pouring in. People wanted to hire Nikki to communicate with their pets, whether they are dead or alive. Nikki says just 4 months after starting her accounts, she had to stop taking bookings. Her waiting list ran in thousands. At one point, about 4,000 people requested her to speak to their pets. Here's what her job entails. The animal communicator studies a photo of an animal. She asks it questions. Nikki says she is often able to telepathically hear the animal's responses. On other occasions, she says she can see imagery or experience emotions connecting her to the animals. Nikki claims that at one instance, she even physically felt the pain of a cat. The cat was really sick. Apparently, neither the pet owner nor the vet could figure out what was going on, what was wrong with the cat. But when Nikki tried to connect with the cat, she claims she felt a pain in her jaw. And that way she figured out that the cat had a tooth infection. And do you know how much Nikki earns doing all of this? A fortune. Nikki charges $350 for a 1-hour session. To do justice to her job, she conducts only 2 meetings a day, and this way Nikki earns $700 daily. Are you having second thoughts about your own job now? WION now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the updates on the move.